The 20th of July, 1944. The Wolfschanze. Germany's headquarters on the Eastern Front. Nestled away in the deep forests of Poland, Adolf Hitler is drawing up plans that he believes could secure his victory in Europe. The Führer's strategies are interrupted by a knock at the door. Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, Hitler's trusted chief of staff, walks in holding a briefcase. But Stauffenberg is not here to talk battle plans. He's here to kill Hitler.
Zwei oder drei Monate vergangen sind, wird euer Terror beseitigt sein. Verwahren wir das Nationalsozialismus.
There were lots of plots to kill Hitler, and he survived so many that it made Hitler feel that he really did have this kind of divine providence behind him that made him survive.
Jugend ist uns verschrieben und verfallen mit
The most celebrated plot against him was the July bomb plot of July 1944, in which you've got this kind of coterie of senior officers all over the Third Reich who have been meeting in secret for many years, actually.
On the 20th of July 1944, Count von Stauffenberg made a serious attempt on the Führer's life by bringing a bomb into the briefing room where Hitler was, placing it under his desk and hoping that it would kill Hitler.
Adolf Hitler, the most notorious dictator of the 20th century. Outraged by the Treaty of Versailles and Germany's humiliation in the First World War, Hitler fiercely campaigned to rescue the fatherland from ruin.
The mood in Germany at the end of World War I was that of a humiliated and defeated people and nation. This fight had been going on for 4 years. Millions of people had died, and no one had got anything or no one had got anywhere. It was a mood of revolution, a mood of deep dissatisfaction, a mood of instability, and it felt like the country was on the brink of collapse.
His mesmerizing public speeches called for a new order in Germany, one which would cast off the weak and incompetent structure of the democratic regime and instead install a supreme national leader. Citizens from all corners of the country fell for the relentless promotion of his ideology, and Hitler successfully recast himself as Germany's savior.
What Hitler is absolutely amazing at is speech making. And to begin to understand Hitler, you've really got to understand that he was the most amazing demagogue. Hitler's speeches are really vitriolic, but they're very effective and they attract regular audiences. And he's really good at using populist themes and he labels scapegoats for losing the war. You name it, Jews, communists, whoever Hitler hates on that given moment, he'll lay into them. Listeners are listening and watching this and they're thinking, yes, these are the reasons for our economic hardships. And Hitler's also got this huge personal magnetism. And he's got this instinctive understanding of the psychology of crowds. And of course, like any really brilliant public speaker, he's going to use that to his advantage. It's like a conductor with an orchestra.
Zwei oder drei Monate vergangen sind, wird euer Terror beseitigt sein. Verwahren wir das Nationalsozialismus.
Like many dictators before him, he became insistent on protecting his godlike image and divine right to power. The Führer kept himself away from the more violent and brutal aspects of the regime. He promoted anti-Jewish propaganda, but refused to bloody his own hands, relying instead on his loyal circle to rid Germany of its enemies.
So the issue of how Hitler managed to keep his popular image clean while the final solution was underway is obviously a very interesting and a very difficult question. But I suppose the essence of it is two things. First of all, that those mass shootings that were taking place in the USSR were not on German soil. And of course, the second part, the most important part too, that the death camps, all of those were on Polish soil, so they were out of the immediate frame of sight or reference of the Germans. So again, in some way, they were happening elsewhere and not really in their immediate field of vision.
Hitler is always mindful of public opinion. I think that it's always important to remember that Hitler, does always worry about what the German people think about him. He doesn't just sort of seize power in 1933 and then not care. He wants to be liked, he wants to be popular, he is a political leader after all, and all political leaders, democratic or fascist or otherwise, want to be liked.
However, Hitler and the Nazis were not entirely immune to the consequences of their dark agenda. Feelings of disillusionment and disgust built up among certain individuals, and by 1944, Hitler faced the biggest threat to his life yet. Out of Hitler's Nazi regime spilled not only a drive to preserve the country's economy and global status, Nazism also meant the annihilation of Germany's enemies. And in 1935, the creation of the Nuremberg laws set its sights firmly on the most hated group in Germany, the Jews.
So we know that from as early as Hitler's writings in Mein Kampf that he was personally anti-Semitic. So we see his personal anti-Semitism translated into state policy. There were many different measures, legal measures, taken against the Jews, and also illegal measures as well. So very early on there was a boycott of Jewish shops and businesses. Very early on too there was a civil service law which essentially threw out Jewish civil servants from their positions. The Nuremberg laws really put into place some legal parameters for how the situation would be with Germany's Jews. But what they did really was to turn Germany's Jews into second-class citizens, really to take away their equal citizenship rights, and also to forbid marriage or sexual relations between Jews and Aryans.
Many citizens bought into the ideology that the very presence of Jews threatened the German people. Ordinary people everywhere began practicing anti-Semitic views and encouraging the idea that Jews were an inferior race, separate to the superior Aryan Germans.
Und wenn die jüdischen Zeitungen heute glauben, auf versteckte Drohungen durch die nationalsozialistische Bewegung einschüchtern zu können, wenn sie heute glauben, unsere Notverordnungen umgehen zu dürfen, sie sollen sich hüten. Einmal wird unsere Geduld zu Ende sein und dann wird den Juden das freche Lügenmaul gestopft werden.
Before long, such poisonous rhetoric turned into violent action, and on the 9th of November 1938, the Nazi regime coordinated a wave of attacks across the country.
You suddenly get this thing called Kristallnacht, the Night of the Broken Glass, in 1938, where the Nazis just literally set fire to synagogues everywhere. The world really noticed, on Kristallnacht, this absolutely horrific destruction, slaughter, violence carried out by the state against its own people. It showed the world what Hitler was. He was effectively a gangster and a murderer.
The violence was supposed to look like an unplanned outburst of popular anger against Jews. But in reality, Kristallnacht was state-sponsored vandalism and arson. Nazi leaders actively coordinated it with Adolf Hitler's support.
There's no doubt about the centrality of anti-Semitism to Hitler's worldview. There's absolutely no doubt about that. But what he seemed to be trying to do was sort of stay in the shadows, so that when we get a pogrom like this, that the public, the German public and the population were quite affronted by it. Maybe not because they particularly supported the Jews, but because it was a sort of flagrant violation of law and order, and sort of a kind of very violent affair across the land. So there wasn't, it wasn't popular in that respect. So there's that idea then that Hitler was sort of staying in the shadows and not being associated with that. I think he managed to maintain his popularity during this time. First of all, because he was staying in the shadows of more unpopular policies. And there was certainly that sentiment among the German population, because of this myth that surrounded the Führer, that, well, if there were unpleasant things going on or policies that they didn't like, then somehow that Hitler couldn't know about it, that he wasn't associated with it, that it had to be one of the other leaders.
Universal approval of the violent pogroms was not a reality for Hitler. In fact, opposition lurked in unexpected places and arose from unexpected individuals. Major General Henning von Treschow absolutely despised the Nuremberg laws and the violent Kristallnacht attacks. From as early as the 1930s, the Nazi officer had been plotting Hitler's overthrow and gathering a trusted circle of people to assassinate the Führer. Treschow's disgust towards extreme anti-Semitism consequently spurred him on to become a key architect of Operation Valkyrie.
Meanwhile, at the graveyard attached to the institution, bodies are exhumed for autopsy. 20,000 are buried here. 15,000 who died in a lethal gas chamber were cremated and their ashes interred. Death books found hidden in the wine cellar of the Hadamar Institution revealed part of the story of the mass killings. The bulky volumes contained thousands of death certificates. Profession unknown, nationality unknown was written after each name.
Feelings of disenchantment, however, did not halt with Hitler's anti-Jewish policies. In 1939, one of the darkest programs of the Nazi regime came into existence. Action T4.
Where Hitler's popularity starts to take a real dent is his association, or the Nazi association, with what is called the T4 program. Now, the T4 program is named after the address in which it was headquartered, Tiergartenstrasse 4 in Berlin. And it really was the most repellent form of kind of Nazi quote-unquote medicine that you could imagine. Because it was this idea that you have to treat a people as a body. But what if you've got part of your body as a population that is considered to be weak, i.e. sort of cancerous or deformed or has hereditary illnesses? Well, why don't you just chop them off as well? Because if you can get rid of them, i.e. people with congenital problems, you're going to stop those bad genes being passed on. And that's essentially what the T4 program is. It is basically chopping people out of life. You're killing them. You're killing children with epilepsy. You're killing people who've got mild spinal deformities. You're killing people who've even got stutters, because you're saying they're genetically weak and we don't want them if we're going to make this strong, blonde, Aryan race full of perfect superhumans. It's kind of pseudo-medicine, it's pseudo-science.
The unlawful system of mass murder outraged many German citizens, particularly Protestants and Catholics who led protests against the exterminations. Relatives of patients everywhere frantically panicked, with many withdrawing their relatives from asylums to care for them at home. In some places, doctors and psychiatrists also cooperated with families to have patients discharged or transferred to private clinics beyond the reach of T4. Führer Chancellery Director Philipp Bohler and physician Karl Brandt led the killing operation. Under their leadership, T4 operatives established 6 gassing installations for adults as part of the euthanasia action. For every person killed, a death certificate was prepared, giving a false but plausible cause of death to hide the evil reality. Hitler publicly cancelled the program in 1941 after outcry from the German people. However, the killings in fact continued until the end of the war. By 1945, the Nazis had callously murdered as many as 300,000 innocent people. The T4 Euthanasia program represented in many ways a rehearsal for Nazi Germany's subsequent genocidal policies. Planners of the final solution later borrowed the gas chamber method to eradicate the Jewish and Roma populations on a scale never before seen in history. Two years into the largest conflict in history, Adolf Hitler devised his riskiest move yet, Operation Barbarossa. Hitler despised Bolshevism and Stalin's regime. Intent on wiping out the Soviet Union, he ordered Nazi troops to invade Russian-occupied territory on the 22nd of June, 1941.
A infantaria italiana rechaçando ataque dos soviéticos. Explosão carro blindado soviético.
Hitler had assured the High Command that we have only to kick in the front door and the whole rotten edifice will come tumbling down. But Russia was not France. Despite the serious losses inflicted on the Red Army and extensive territorial gains, the mission to completely destroy Soviet fighting power was not achieved. The Soviets were not going to go down easily.
Had Hitler stopped after he had successfully conquered France and the Low Countries and not decided in June 1941 that he was going to invade this really quite big country called Russia, he may have stayed in power. But of course, what Stalin's got is a lot of room to fight in, because he can retreat and retreat and retreat and retreat, and you've still got thousands of miles of Russia behind you that you can fall back on. But also what Stalin does is he's very good at regrouping and getting his forces back together. Germans use a lot of over-designed tanks, over-designed uniforms, over-designed weapons. What the Russians are good at doing is just getting things together in a kind of makeshift way, but that works. You know, everything the Russians have, uniforms, tanks, weaponry, it's all really simple, really easy to use, really easy to mass produce very, very quickly. German kit takes ages to produce. So this is another real problem that's faced by the Germans.
1942 would be an even worse year for Hitler's fight in the East. The Führer hoped to take the strategic city of Stalingrad easily. But the well-armed Red Army and the fierce Russian winter made German soldiers' lives absolute hell. By mid-November, the Germans found themselves outnumbered, outgunned, extremely low on food and medical supplies, and surrounded by Russians. But Hitler refused to withdraw troops. He placed prestige over lives and commanded They hold their positions to the last man and the last round. He also promised additional provisions that never arrived.
So when the tide of the war turned in 1943 with the Battle of Stalingrad, and then the fortunes went the other way, then that sort of question of the infallibility of the Führer came to be called into question. So whilst by this point, after Stalingrad, the cult of the leader was diminished somewhat, he'd created this myth of the Soviet hordes and this great Soviet enemy to such an extent that out of fear and out of desperation, both the army and the home front really worked until the bitter end before capitulation.
Left with little choice, German General Friedrich Paulus went against Hitler's orders and surrendered his weakened troops to Russia on February 2, 1943, an act which Hitler later called treason. The heavy defeat punctured the Führer's power in Europe, and a lurking feeling of disenchantment spread throughout the German army. Stalingrad soon became a major catalyst for conspirators across the Third Reich to join the plot to kill Hitler. Klaus von Stauffenberg was no exception. He had witnessed firsthand the absolute catastrophe on the Eastern Front and became convinced that Hitler had to be removed. Stauffenberg was born into an aristocratic family. Despite joining the Wehrmacht, he, like many elites, tended to view the Nazis with distaste. However, it would not just be a class issue that persuaded Stauffenberg to turn away from his divine leader. His time on the Eastern Front opened his eyes to the mass murder of Jews and Slavs. Outraged, the young officer openly stated, "They are shooting Jews in masses. These crimes must not be allowed to continue."
As well as places like Auschwitz, which were relatively easy to keep quite secret, what people also knew about from troops returning from the front, and especially from the Eastern Front, was the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing squads that went behind the German lines, killing anybody they regarded as being an enemy of the Third Reich, such as Jews and communists and so on. And the Einsatzgruppen killed millions of people, and it was impossible to keep that quiet.
Stauffenberg became so vocal in his criticism, his officers decided that he should be posted to Tunisia, a move which would end with Stauffenberg losing his left eye, his right hand, and 2 fingers in a surprise attack by American fighter aircraft. Stauffenberg's life-changing injuries did not hinder his mission to rid Germany of its ruthless dictator. Instead, his fate placed him in an even better position to implement the plot, right at the heart of Berlin. In September 1943, Stauffenberg was posted to the headquarters of the replacement army on the Bendlerstrasse. Here, he would be introduced to 2 key conspirators, Major General Henning von Treschow and General Friedrich Olbricht. The tide of the war was now turning against Germany. The trio had to move fast to implement the plot.
We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on beaches, landing grounds, in fields, in streets, and on the hills. We shall never surrender.
Albrecht put forward a new strategy for staging a coup against Hitler. The replacement army had an operational plan called Operation Valkyrie, to be used in the event of a breakdown of law and order. Valkyrie was the perfect way to mobilize the reserve army during the takeover. Treschow and Stauffenberg worked tirelessly to modify Valkyrie and at the same time remain undiscovered. The pair drafted plans to occupy German cities, take control of Heinrich Himmler's SS and Gestapo, and even arrest the Nazi leadership. The plotters finalized every tiny detail, even devising a whole new government structure following takeover. General Ludwig Beck would be placed as head of state. The long-term resistor Dr. Karl Friedrich Gödler would become Germany's new chancellor. Treschow would take control of all German security services, and either Albrecht or Stauffenberg would serve as state secretary. The only question that remained was how to kill Hitler.
There were lots of plots to kill Hitler, and he survived so many that it made Hitler feel that he really did have this kind of divine providence behind him that made him survive. But actually the most kind of celebrated plot against him was the July bomb plot of July 1944, in which you've got this kind of coterie of senior officers all over the Third Reich who've been meeting in secret for many years, actually. What they want to do is to get rid of Hitler. And they don't want to get rid of Hitler because he's evil. That may be part of it. They want to get rid of Hitler because they think he's fighting the war badly. And they just are fed up with him. And indeed, Hitler is fighting the war badly because he's a terrible, terrible strategist.
The conspirators considered poisoning his food and even shooting the Führer at a dinner party. But by late 1943, Hitler had become increasingly paranoid and suspicious, often abruptly changing plans or tightening access. In the end, a time bomb was the only option. At the time of planning, none of the conspirators had direct access to Adolf Hitler. However, in 1944, everything changed for Stauffenberg. General Friedrich Fromm, the commander of the replacement army, appointed Stauffenberg as his chief of staff. Fromm was the only officer other than Hitler who could initiate Operation Valkyrie with his signature. Aware of his subordinate's plan, he made a deal to remain quiet on the condition that he became a top official in the new government after the mutiny. The plan was coming into place, and Stauffenberg was now in a position where he could see Hitler on a regular basis. Of all the conspirators, he was the best placed to become the assassin. Time was ticking. Certain defeat in the war closed in, and the coup needed to take place soon to save Germany from total destruction. The army had posted Treschow to the Eastern Front, and the original assassin, General Helmut Stieff, had backed down from the plan. Stauffenberg took total control of the resistance, but in doing so, he placed himself as both the assassin and the commander of the Valkyrie operation in Berlin. Hidden away in the dark shadows of the Masurian woods, Hitler was gathering his most trusted officers for a military conference at the Wolfschanze. It was the 20th of July 1944, and Stauffenberg found himself in the Eastern Front headquarters alongside his aide, Lieutenant Werner von Haiften. Briefcase in hand, the colonel now had the perfect opportunity to plant a bomb that could change the course of history forever.
So on 20th of July 1944, everything's in place. You've got people in Berlin ready to take over the SS. You've got various army units all over the Third Reich ready to go at the drop of the code word Valkyrie, which is going to say that Hitler's been killed.
However, The summer sun had reared its brutal head. The atmosphere was intense and uncomfortable, and, irritated by the heat, Hitler moved the meeting from the Führer bunker to a wooden hut. At 12:30 p.m., Stauffenberg excused himself to a nearby room, claiming he needed to change his shirt. But in reality, the pair began fusing the first bomb. A guard knocked at the door, urging the colonel to hurry up. Haeften and Stauffenberg panicked. The Führer was waiting, and no time remained to fuse the second bomb. One bomb would have to do. As the seconds slipped away, Stauffenberg swiftly excused himself under the pretext of making a phone call. But unbeknownst to the would-be assassin, Colonel Heinz Brandt, positioned next to Hitler, inadvertently collided with the briefcase, deftly nudging it behind a table leg. The fate of Europe now hung in the balance. At 12:42 p.m., the bomb detonated. Shockwaves reverberated through the Wolfschanze. Stauffenberg and Haeften quickly escaped, driving to a nearby airfield to return to Berlin and finish the job. The hopes of resistance crumbled as the aftermath unfolded. Stauffenberg, Olbricht, and Ludwig Beck rushed to commandeer various government buildings and arrested General Fromm for refusal to cooperate until Hitler's death had been confirmed. But soon came the news they had been fearing. Hitler was, in fact, very much alive.
As it happened, the furniture took most of the blast, and Hitler got away with just very, very superficial injuries, and put into place straight away the capture, the arrest, and then the execution of all of those who were involved in that bomb plot.
Had the bomb found its place to Hitler's left, had the meeting unfolded in the Führer bunker, and had Stauffenberg triggered both devices, the assassination's success would have seemed inevitable. Yet fate intervened. Hitler emerged with only limited injuries, sheltered by a table leg that absorbed the brunt of the blast. The plan had faltered. The tables had turned. The dream of a world without Hitler slipped through the grasp of those who dared to defy. Furious and humiliated, Hitler ordered commanding officer Otto Ernst Remer to arrest the conspirators and bring them to him alive. But a bitter General Fromm had other ideas. To hide his involvement, Fromm ordered immediate court-martials. The conspirators now faced swift and brutal reprisals for their bold attempt to alter the course of history. Ludwig Beck asked for a pistol and shot himself, the first of many suicide attempts in the coming days. At 0010 hours on the 21st of July 1944, Colonel von Stauffenberg, General Friedrich Olbricht, Lieutenant Werner von Haeften, and another officer, Albrecht Merz von Quernhem, were killed by firing squad in the Blenderblock courtyard. On the Eastern Front, Treskov learned of the plotters' fate and committed suicide. Until the end, he remained loyal to the cause. The plot to kill Hitler was well and truly over. The 20th of July plot serves as a testament to the bravery of those who dared to stand against a ruthless regime, even in the face of almost insurmountable odds. If the plan had succeeded, it would have undoubtedly shortened the war by many months and saved countless lives. However, Hitler's days were still numbered, and he would face the looming shadow of death sooner rather than later. The Russians moved steadily from the east, whilst the Western Allies crossed the Rhineland. By April 1945, 3 million Soviet troops dealt brutal blows to the last traces of the German resistance. With the Russians at the gates to Berlin, Adolf Hitler had nowhere to run.
The first half of 1945 is probably the darkest 6 months in Germany's history, because it's being invaded by the Russians, the Red Army from the east, and you've got the other allies coming through from the west. And it's the Russians who reach Berlin first. And when they reach Berlin, it's a city in rubble, it's a city in flames, it's a city in chaos, it's a city in which squads of marauding loyal Nazis are going around hanging people who are not taking part in the resistance to the city. It's a city in which you then got some Nazis committing suicide. It is the most benighted, appalling place you can imagine. And you've got the Soviet army literally raping and pillaging this city.
Towards the end of the war, of course, Hitler was spending more and more time in his mountain retreat, the Berghof, and then people were seeing less of him. He was making less and less public appearances, and then eventually, in the last months of the war, into the Führer bunker. And this is when public opinion of the Führer starts to crumble.
Hitler's last days in the Führer bunker under the Reich Chancellery in the centre of Berlin, are a kind of terrible end of a Shakespearean tragedy, as the thunder Russian artillery all around them, and they're deep inside this sort of concrete underground fortress. Everybody's sort of kind of going mad, and especially Hitler.
On April the 30th, he committed suicide in his bunker. As the city at the heart of his 1,000-year Reich burned to the ground and crumbled in ruins around him. The war in Europe ended forever on May the 7th, 1945, and Hitler's rule was finally over.
The question of how much the Germans knew about what had happened to the Jewish population is very complex. So certainly they knew that their Jewish compatriots were disappearing, being taken away. They were being taken away, they believed, as indeed some of the Jewish people themselves believed, they were taken away to work in the East.
During the war, word leaked out from people who had escaped some camps. There were aerial pictures taken of places like Auschwitz. So, by the middle of the war, the world at large had a very good idea that this slaughter was being carried out on an industrial scale.
Yes, some rumours did circulate back from soldiers on leave, and other information did filter back to the Reich, but the German population was busy with facing its own war, dealing on a day-to-day basis with the course of the war, Allied bombings, rationing, food shortages. There was a deliberate policy on the part of the Nazis that this extermination should take place not on German soil. So these death camps were all in Poland, so they were out of the direct line of vision of the German population.
When the Germans fully appreciated what had been done in their name by the Nazis, it took a very long time for that to sink in. If you look at public opinion polls carried out in the 40s and the 50s in Germany, there was still a lot of residual affection for Nazism. It was felt that this was something that had made Germany great again. It was something that had got things moving and done. Yes, there had been excesses, the small matter of the Holocaust, clearly. But some people in Germany were willing just to say, if we can divorce the kind of genocide bit from Nazism, is Nazism so bad? A minority of Germans were still, affectionate towards Nazism and towards Hitler.
The tyrannical force of Nazi Germany sent the world into chaos. An empire of hate, violence, and discrimination had spread across the world like a virus.
The atrocities of the Nazi regime came to popular attention. Both the Western and the Soviet forces came to liberate the Nazi camps, and they were absolutely shocked and horrified with what they found. And once that became known to the German people as well, then they were, again, absolutely horrified and appalled about what had been carried out in their name by the Hitler dictatorship.
Hitler's rule left a mark on history, a reminder that this behavior should never be tolerated, and the world should not dismiss such brutal atrocities again.
Certainly, there are a lot of reasons why you might have voted for Hitler in the 30s, not all of which involved you being evil. But certainly if you were a fan of Hitler after the war still, and after all the revelations that had come out, then I would say you definitely are evil.
Today, the Valkyrie conspirators are memorialized as heroes, even inscribed into the very geography of Germany through street names. A reminder that in times of darkness, there will always be those brave enough to fight evil, even from the inside.
German guns, German bombs.
In diesen 13 Jahren haben sie auf allen Gebieten jammervoll versagt.